Hi, everybody. Um, just wanted to say hello to everybody. And this is our guest speaker session today. Just reminding everybody that our meetings, the first meeting of every month is our project check-ins, and our second meeting of every month is spaced reserved for guest speakers. So we're going to kick that off today. I'm going to turn it over to Meg, who has done all the hard work of getting our guest speakers today, and she's going to introduce the topic. But just wanted to just briefly say, let us know who you are in the chat, where you're coming from. If you're new, let us know that. We always like to see if you're new, and we really encourage you to utilize the chat during the session today to get questions in front of the guest speakers and just ongoing comments and about the stuff that you're hearing that you find of value. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Meg, who's gonna lead us through the rest of the session today. So it's all yours, Meg.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, everybody, for taking time out from what is on your desk today. We've got a really special session. I can't wait to introduce our two speakers. Some of the backstory here is that there's a DC-based organization called the Center for Democracy and Technology that also does a lot of work with the coalition. And when we were casting around our network, like who is doing that down to the metal leadership on the readiness and adoption issues that we care about, who should we spotlight in the GovAI Coalition? The absolute first organization that came to mind is the Open Contracting Partnership, and it is an international organization with connectivity to governments that they're going to be sharing knowledge from today. So we're very lucky to be joined by Georg Neumann, the head of communications for OCP, and Katrin Frauscher, who's the deputy executive director. And their presentation is called Is Your Government Ready to Buy AI? A practical webinar with tips and tricks no matter where you are on your AI procurement journey. If you're following along at home, they're also going to be building off this AI buying guide that their organization recently published, and we could not be more happy to have you. Thanks for taking the time out, Katrin and Georg. Over to you.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. We are so delighted to be here with all of you. We have met some of you. We have joined GovAI events before. You will see beside you in the guide as an example of how coming together and sharing good practices can really help, and also some of the guidance that all of you developed. So it is really wonderful to be here and see so many of you. So in terms of the agenda, if we go to the next slide, Georg. So I don't see it. Is maybe a little delay?
It is,
Oh, okay.
I think.
Do you all see an agenda slide or just a cover slide right now?
Just the title slide.
Yeah, me
Okay.
too. Also, the sharing might not be working right now. But while we are fixing that, it's a pretty straightforward plan for the session. We will introduce ourselves just a tiny bit more. Still not. We will give you some, now, thank you. We will give you some framing of how we arrived and how we see, the world of procuring AI. We will give you some strategies, hopefully, that are helpful for those of you who are on the business of buying technology and AI. And then, because we know, right, that all the things that you could do in theory, you're not actually always able to do in practice, given what your procurement, law, environment capabilities are. We are hoping to leave you with some hacks. We will pause throughout for questions. Neither Georg nor I am a huge fan of just talking at you. So hopefully, you have questions for us, and we would love to hear what is and is not working for you all. So you already shared who is in the room, so feel free to ignore that first part. But I would love to hear if you could write in the chat, if you haven't done so, what is your function? And then also, how confident are you in buying AI? So if you are an agency or a government entity, Or if you are, an accompanying organization, a consultant, if you could tell us, what's your experience with buying AI? And so you could just write strong, medium, low, because that will help us a little bit know what we're going to talk about for the rest of the session. And if you haven't introduced yourself yet, please keep going. It's great to see where you are from and what you do. So we would love to hear how confident are you in buying AI? Thanks to Michael for sharing. Medium. I feel like that's most of us also in the use of AI, right? We all understand a little bit about AI, but not many of us fully understand it. So thanks for sharing that. Great. So a little bit more about us. As Meg already said, we are a nonprofit. You can think about us as a civic tech organization. We work both in the United States, but also around the world. So we might be able to share some examples of what other countries and cities outside of the US are doing. And our bread and butter is really to improve procurement processes and re-engineer procurement so that it delivers better outcomes for the people and the planet. Within that, we especially focus on technology procurement, and this is how we found our way to AI, because AI itself, it's a technology, but it's also being integrated more and more into AI. So if we come to the next slide, over the last few years, many of our partners in the US, but also internationally, kept asking us, hey, but how do I buy this thing? It's already hard for me to maybe buy certain technology products or be agile in my procurement, and now I'm doing this very complicated thing. Can you help us? I think one interesting thing about us is as well, we also build procurement and technology tools. So we also use AI. So we have both those of experiences that come together. However, today we are not talking to you about how you use AI for better procurement. We are happy to come back and talk to you about how you can use AI to make procurement better. But today we're focusing on how to buy AI, if that distinction makes sense. Great. So let me stop here for a moment, and I will see if anyone has a question for us about open contracting or what we're about to do. You can always unmute yourself at any point and just speak up. It will not be impolite, just easier for us to hear, or you can write in the chat. Otherwise, we will dive in.
Thank you, Katrin. I don't think we've really introduced ourselves, but Katrin Frauscher is our deputy director, and she's been leading a lot of our US work. We have our head of director of the US as well, Andre Lima, who is currently out, but normally he would be here as well. And I'm Georg Neumann. I've been working on technology, anti-corruption and innovation for the last 20 years. So I'm quite excited to explore how to do it better and how to do it in a way that it actually supports the public benefit rather than big tech companies. And as we look at how AI enters the government, you see here's AI. A lot of us might be experiencing that feeling of like, oh, surprise! Suddenly there's AI in my office document, the Copilot popping up like Clippy, a couple of years ago. But if we look at it more structurally, we see kind of like procuring enterprise licenses and off-the-shelf products. You have your Copilots, your Gemini, ChatGPT, Claudes. You have more advanced ways of like customizing tool with specific features, translation features, different types of workflow processes supported by AI, and completely new tools, which there are very few examples yet that we can point to of really new tool development, but that's kind of like the more complex ways of integrating tools. And then there's side door access to to that, sort of like pilots with private sector and academia, different types of kind of like, oh, let's test this out. It's important to make sure that these pilots kind of are never ending, from pilot to pilot to pilot. And then there's obviously a lot of personal use. A lot of us use, our own personal subscription services for ChatGPT and others. And that kind of like, is something that needs to be recognized as well. And, as we've mentioned, the surprise AI, is often that we see existing software contracts, framework contracts, sort of like suddenly being added or enriched by AI tools that no one has asked for, or that, aren't clearly communicated either. And, this poses a lot of kind of like questions, and we hope that we'll be able to respond to a couple of those. Secondly, our question is really about like, okay, how is AI different from technology procurement? And in many ways, it isn't. There's a lot of things that are similar. It's good technology procurement, but there are quite a number of things what make it specific, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So one thing is, AI is rapidly growing and changing. So we're changing kind of like models of AI, like every half year, every 3 months, there's new models, and each of these come with different capabilities. So if we just look back sort of like a year ago, and where we were in terms of like what AI could do, it's very different from what you do now. So if you bought an AI service or tool built on technology from last year, you're already behind. So like understanding that here, there's a lot of new vendors that are coming in, and the technology itself is changing as well. This kind of like creates specific pressures on procuring AI. And it carries a unique combination of risks, just when we look at data and biases, safeguards and liabilities, and ownership questions over the information as well. And last but not least, also like environmental questions, and where that kind of like what kind of impact data infrastructure needed for AI sort of like has on the environment. The one good news over the last year that we can sort of like point to is that most of the, at least state governments, some of you might have been at the Code for America Summit last year, and Code for America kind of like published a government AI landscape. And last year, when we're sort of like doing our research for the Buying AI Guide, there was very little kind of like guidance really on some of these questions around readiness of like what kind of capabilities must exist, what kind of guidelines are there for responsible AI practice. And the good news is this has changed quite a bit. So now sort of like at least most, if not all of the states have some sort of guidance in place. I'm not sure how that looks because I see a lot of you come from cities, how much that is trickling down to cities. And, I think that's the next level again as well. But at least at the state level, we see that there is more in place, and some good examples that one can point to, like Georgia, for example, has a really good and solid, complete AI guidelines framework, so to say, and strategy. But when we come at practical examples, it's only still 50% of the states that have some sort of practical examples of implementing AI pilots. And most of them that is decentralized and often sort of based on internal productivity tools. So we're still at the beginning of the AI journeys, but we know that it's changing rapidly, and we know that there are a lot of risks. So how do we manage those risks? And, there's different types of risk, and we don't want it to be too negative, but it's something that is important to understand as we look at AI more broadly. So, we have AI use risks, something we're not discussing today. So we'll focus on procurement risks and AI-specific procurement risks. So when we look at kind of like the procurement risks that exist, it's really, we've mentioned tech is changing fast, vendor lock-in, and sort of like look at how do you manage pricing structures so that you don't pay much more later, or like, your subscriptions. I always have it with cable TV, sort of like every month or every year it gets more expensive and I can't do anything about it. This is something similar with like technology and procurement. And then sort of like dependencies are very critical, as well as sort of like existing tech teams and framework contracts and new vendors that don't have the experience of working with governments or local governments come in. And just like how much strong contract management matters for this results. And these are all kind of like general procurement practices that tend to sort of like bring in their risks. And these are sort of exacerbated by some of the AI-specific risks, where we look at just this question of like AI doesn't really, as just a quick sort of like definition, we talk about Gen AI and agentic AI tools, often large language models and sort of like and the likes. And when they lack a general understanding of the world and the problem, so it's you need to really define the problem and rather than focus on a specific solution. So you have translations, but maybe that's not the right problem. So really thinking around what is the problem is needed to help you with these solutions. There's a lot around training data and what kind of input goes into the model to ensure that what comes out is actually applicable and valuable for the procurement and for sort of like the service that is being procured. So that's very specific to AI as well, much more so than data as well. There is also very limited availability and ability to explain results, and often a lack of transparency around how models function. So that's a huge risk, because there's, you can't backtrack why certain results are coming or emerging. Something to keep in mind when you define what KPIs are and how these are being achieved and established throughout the process. And then finally, and I think that might be one of the key questions that are not different necessarily from technology procurement, but are very strongly yet unknown in how this is going to evolve. And this is around ongoing support and use costs around AI use. Sort of like your budget needs to account for this, but also there's very little transparency yet on how much specific token use or per user costs are going to exist. And as AI companies are under pressure to sort of like recoup their investments into data infrastructure, these costs are at risk of increasing very strongly. So understanding that, it's kind of like a service or a contract could be a good deal in the beginning, but if you don't keep in mind what the future costs are going to be, this is likely going to be very different from a normal technology procurement. I see a question there. Albert, yes, please.
Yeah, George, I'm loving this. I just I think about the last 20 years in public sector IT, and I feel like there was the base cost that people were paying for services, and then there was the service credit costs that kept piling up for us. And I'm trying to build some historical parallels here to better understand how to think about my AI costs. It feels like there's the subscription or the seat cost, and there's also this token cost, and how maybe you'll get into this later, but I just like how do you see people managing this risk, or do you have practices on doing that?
It's a great question, and I do think that is actually one of the questions where there are not yet a lot of answers. And one reason is because there's not a lot of transparency around cost structures for AI tools, because there's very one-on-one conversations between AI service providers and buyers. So for us, idea is open contracting. It's sort of like bringing procurement practices into the open so that everyone has the same kind of like conditions when they purchase. So that's one of the key responses, is to really make sure is like there is a clear transparency around what the costs are. One thing that is not mentioned here is but sort of like this upgrade costs for like one existing model to new models or to new tools that can get very costly as well. Sort of like the change orders to update and adjust for making sure that you're on the latest AI model. And again, this is not something that is it's often overseen in the kind of like contract documents. I think from our perspective, we need to be much more clear about those costs amongst buyers. And I think there's kind of like creating that leverage from buyers, also understanding, collaboratively who pays what for how much. Because, the buyers, the vendors can come to you with like great proposals of like, oh, we give you the first year for free, but, what does that mean over a year? So much more transparency is, from our perspective, a key element, and being very clear on what are the different cost models that are integrated. We have some ideas for how we can do that even better. And Katrin just posted some ideas in there as well for examples.
Yeah, and I can just say I've seen the cost models that I've seen to Meg's question are obviously the license, the service of install, service credits for like teaching people how to use the tool, and then usage credits. And so there's these like 4 levers that I've seen around the cost, and each of the vendors that I've seen proposing costs to us are it's different.
Yeah. So I think Boston, the case study shared by Katrin, does a good job of that, but it's exactly that sort of like, it's easy to forget which are the different elements, particularly when it comes to AI solutions. Excellent. Great question. So to summarize kind of like the framework and where we're at is sort of like to get the best from AI, you need kind of like organizational readiness. And we haven't talked too much about this because we feel like that's something that I think is the key question that we've seen being discussed over the last year, sort of like making sure that people talk to each other across different teams, that you have kind of like policies that kind of like establish how you as a city approach AI in terms of responsible data use and responsible kind of like modeling, how this really kind of like translates into creating value-aligned tech, sort of like making sure that the technology that is being bought is also really driven by public sector interest, right? And it's clear that AI is not neutral. So you want to kind of like choose vendors that are aligned with your values as much as possible. And that includes something like data sovereignty, transparency, and other safeguards. And then finally, and I think, that's something that we've been advocating for in procurement kind of across the board, but again, with AI, where we come with a solution, it's much more important to highlight, what is the problem, right? So outcome-driven procurement practices are critical, talking to the different stakeholders, making sure it's human-centered and, engaging with the market on what is possible and what is good value, right? And I think one risk is here that you over-specify some of the specifications when you do procurement, but, public sector doesn't necessarily have to be, the expert in AI, but they have to be an expert in their problem. So you really want to make sure that you understand the problem that you want to solve and describe that very detailed, and then make sure that you get the best solution for it. And with that, I'll hand over to Katrin to give you some good practices throughout the procurement process that hopefully will help you do that. But yeah, if there are more questions.
Yeah, wondering maybe, so Georg talked a lot about the risks. Are there other risks that you are experiencing or seeing, especially as I come to the part where I talk about the strategies to address some of these risks? Would be good to hear a little bit more, either by someone speaking up or by writing in the chat. What are some of the risks and challenges that you deal with when you buy AI? Or I think many people gave thumbs up to the surprise AI, it suddenly shows up on your work computer. Any additional thoughts on that?
Or Aeneas.
Great, yeah. Thank you, Mac. We will talk a little bit about how you can evaluate. Good point. Okay, so let me dive in, and then please feel free to chime in. Again, just speak up, especially if I don't see everyone. So if I don't see your raised hand, don't feel it's rude. Just interrupt or write something in the chat. So I will talk to you about some practical strategies of how to buy value-aligned AI, that addresses some of these risks that Georg just talked about. And first, I just want to acknowledge, procurement for many governments looks like this, right? It's antiquated. It does not fit 2026. And in order to buy a technology like AI, you don't want to have one of these phones that we used, many, many decades ago. But we feel your pain. And like I said, especially throughout, but especially at the end, we will give you some hacks that you can use, even if your procurement still looks like this. And I will walk you through the phases. So when we think about procurement often we start with planning. You're making a plan to purchase, to buy, to enhance, to improve something. Then there's the stage where you put that out to the market. That can look in many different ways. It can be a full request for proposals, but it also could just be a quick PO. Or you have existing vendor pools and benches that you're using, so it's a solicitation stage. Then you choose whom you're going to work with, what you're going to buy, might be products or teams. You evaluate, so we will talk about that. And then a really important phase that people often forget about is the management, right? How you actually manage your contract, how you pay your vendor. A lot of that matters as well. So for each of these 5 stages, I will give you a few strategies of how to deal with that. So in the planning, Georg already talked a little bit about that. And I loved what you said about, as the government, you don't need to understand AI, but you do need to understand the problem that you're trying to solve. And that is really the first problem here, being really clear about your use case and making sure that AI is a good fit for solving this use case. We won't go into that today because I know you all have talked a lot about that already, but that is really the foundation for any good procurement, is making sure you need it. Another one, and it seems so basic, that it seems silly to say it, but again, in government that can happen, can be more challenging. And it's about bringing, your key stakeholder together. And this is both stakeholders from outside the government, but also within your government and working collaboratively. And then we already talked about the budget, so I won't repeat it here, but it's really thinking through your budget, over the coming years. While you budget for 1 year, and you might only have the budget for that current fiscal year, in the end, you have to budget for the following years as well. And then in terms of the stage, when you ask, the market or the vendors to respond to your request, a key step here is, like I said before, is bringing different stakeholders together. We see over and over again, that IT or procurement coming late. So if it's an agency that's buying a department, right, not always this cross-fertilization, these conversations are not often happening. So working together from the beginning is also really important. Another one is, we like to say, ask the market what's possible, but don't fall in love, right? Because vendors are very good in pitching. But we will talk about that more when we come to the evaluation stage as well. Is you want to make sure that they actually can do what they're promising you to do. And for that, market research, past performance, you can do requests for information, right? Asking what's possible before you go and buy. All of you, I assume you know about pilots and sandbox, but actually testing before you fully commit and buy, I think it's something especially important for AI purchases. And then using enterprise license, we like to say, not as your final destination, but as something that you can build on. Many of us, in government, we have to and work with enterprise licenses, but you can still go and adapt them and adjust them and build on them by bringing in, if you have the budget, project teams and others, so that you can, like I said, build on them. So here, Mike, this slide is for you, evaluations. And all of these go together, right? So if you have an outcome-driven request for proposals, an outcome-driven solicitation, how you judge also is different. If you are, working with times and materials, especially, but also for, enterprise licenses, thinking about how you can see that it will do the job. So thinking about bake-offs, right, where you give the vendor a challenge with real data, maybe in a real life environment, to build something small that uses AI and you see how it performs is one way of doing it, similar to a sandbox. You can also do show and tells. And then one thing is, usually someone has worked with these vendors before and they can actually tell you how good it's going or not so good. So, asking your friends and colleagues in other places, I think, is also really important. And while we also want to be careful sometimes, I don't know how many procurement officers are in this room, right? But if you're a procurement officer, you don't also have to be an AI expert and a subject matter expert, right? It's hard to be an expert on everything in life, but you can bring in the right people who know which questions to ask and how to evaluate some of these proposals. And in terms of very practical terms, what I wrote here under technical, these are some of the things that you would be surprised that you often don't see yet in government requests for proposals, right? Thinking about APIs, requesting API interoperability, making sure that if you're working with any kind of rules engines, that you actually can make modifications when a rule changes, if you have this capacity to do that it's not all vendor dependent, and also that it fits into your integrations. That goes back to some of the risks that Georg described in the beginning, to avoid vendor lock-in and to prepare yourself for transitions. Some of these technical requirements are important to ensure that you can do that at a later stage. So these are all good things to ask about during your evaluation stage. I only have, I think, 2 more. So this is one of my favorite slides, right? Because one other thing that in government sometimes happens, right? You can blame the vendor for a lot of things, but it's not always the vendor's fault, right? Sometimes we get exactly what we ask for based on how our contracts are written. Because many contracts, still don't have performance metric, or they don't specify what happens if there is a mistake or delivery is not happening. So some of the things that we wrote here about are practical tools, if you can incorporate them, depending on what type of contract you have, that ensure higher quality and more vendor accountability. So paying for outcomes instead of, for just deliverables. Having SLAs, because that really makes sure that if there's a defect or response targets, that there are penalties, right, if delivery is not happening. Also, what we already talked about, protecting exit rights, which often does not happen. But so requiring open APIs, making sure that you have access to all of your own data, and transition support, all of that helps when you move on to another one. The strong government speaks more about, how you work together, which speaks to a strong partnership between the government and the vendor, so that you can have these weekly check-ins, and make sure that things are happening. Great, and I'm seeing Deborah's question, so maybe let's come back to that. So cybersecurity is definitely something really important that you want to think about as well in your procurement, in your contract negotiations. And yes, how you notify if that happens, it's a good question as well. Let me actually, maybe before we go to hacks, are there any other questions that came up for someone, or have you tried one of these strategies and it's working for you, or maybe you have heard from a coalition member or someone else, that they are doing that and it has led to good results or not so good results? No? Okay, then I move on to my hacks and see if there is something there that will, otherwise we have some discussion questions for you in a moment, because we were really hoping that we can all talk with each other versus us just talking at you. So these are some things that I already mentioned, but it's kind of your cheat sheet. So, if you walk away with here trying to remember 4 things that you can do that are very practical, no matter what your procurement environment is, and even if it's a bit more antiquated still, we hope that these are 4 tips that will actually help you. Let me start with the last one actually here. Which is that sometimes, your own government environment might not have vendors yet or ready pools that you can buy from, but there are some vendor pools that are open to everyone. So if you look at the GSA or NASPO or other cooperative purchasing agreements, you might be able to piggyback on existing contracts and use them to get something that works for you. The same is, seeing which vendors you're already working with, and if there can be a contract amendment to get features, technology, or something that would be interesting to you. The other things we already talked about in terms of hacks, to make sure that you get good outcomes is, asking for pilots or sandboxes before you commit to actually a full procurement. I know that it's not always possible, but if that is something you can discuss either with your IT or procurement team, try before you buy is definitely, yes, Albert says that, great. Jinx is definitely a good strategy that is highly recommended. And then again, saying if you use an enterprise license, is there any way that you could bring in a service team that can help you build on that and use the enterprise licenses to do something more customized using them as a foundation? So those are our 4 tips and tricks. And I think with that, we did want to hand it over to you. Maybe I can show you our discussion questions. Was that the next and last slide? Oh no, let me tell you one. Let's go first to the discussion questions, and then I come back to this if we don't get
There's
so
a good
much.
question on like our vendor pushback.
Yeah. Do you experience any vendor pushback, or is this relatively easy to achieve? I do think you should expect vendor pushback. Yes. I mean, sorry, not for some of these tips and tricks, but I think generally, like when you go to more performance-based pay or during contract negotiations, right, vendors do obviously negotiate. But I do think here it comes to maybe also the type of vendor. I do think there are many vendors out there that are also interested in outcomes and want to work in more agile, performance-oriented ways. So if you have I think Georg said it in the beginning, thinking about value-aligned tech. There are different types of vendor out there, and that's also why procurement process matters, because it helps you find vendors that maybe are more aligned with you than others. Otherwise, if people are a little quiet, then maybe Georg can post one more time the link to our AI guide, and I can tell you a little bit more about our AI guide. So actually, the link is right there. Please do check it out. It's called Buying AI at opencontracting.org. So this is something we wrote last year, and it was written with practitioners for practitioners. It especially has procurement teams in mind. And we were approached by many of our government partners, and they were telling us, I really don't understand AI. So when we started this, we didn't quite think, oh, we first, we'll have chapters on what is AI and how you get AI ready. But it makes sense, right? That if you're trying to buy something that's so new, that first you need to understand it. So you will see that the first few chapters are focused on these like foundational understandings that will help you be a better purchaser. And then we go into a lot of these strategies and tips and tricks that I just explained with more templates and tools that you can use. And then you might also be interested in seeing some of the case studies where we also, I think we talk about San Jose. I've seen someone is here, and some of the GovAI members actually are featured under case studies. And I see Lan has a question or a contribution to make. Please go for it.
Yeah, thank you. It definitely offers a clarifying framework to think about. My question, I do have a question, which is to Meg and Richard's comments in the chat window. It is hard already, and then adding qualitative aspects to this whole thing. Are you aware of any tools that could help cast some light in building up a quantitative metrics with qualitative questions built in as well? I know some jurisdictions are very much interested in leveraging such.
So you mean, so when you are buying a technology, could you give me a concrete example? Maybe what exactly, is it sector specific or a productivity tool, or say a little bit more? Or if someone else wants to chime in because you already understood quicker than me what Lan is talking about, then please chime in.
I will share a bit about the case in my mind. Say a police department or a legal department in a jurisdiction, they already have some AI tools, say Microsoft Copilot, etc. But they also wanted to provide training to their staff so that they can leverage the tools even more effectively. Now, what kind of training, how to design that training? So if there are metrics already in place that they can utilize to measure the AI tools, one, and to also measure the readiness and the staff members' current status, then it may, like earlier you mentioned about, for them to know what is good, what good looks like is very important, right? So maybe the evaluation metrics could include such a question, say, hey, collect such answers from the staff so that when this survey or whatever format is done, then there are very clear metrics to guide the people in charge in selecting the content for the training. And then after the training, they can run this metrics again, and then they can see very clearly the before and after. So that's just some ideal situation that some leaders are seeking.
Thank you. That's so helpful.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love that you talk about staff readiness. And I think pointing again to my mind came Boston again, who they did a great job. They actually also link access to the AI tool to first completing training and certain certifications. And then they have measures throughout to see how people are using it and how useful they are finding it. And then only if it's helpful and useful are they rolling out more and building on top of that. So I love that. But also see, Deborah, did you want to add anything, given that this is your line of work?
Yeah, so what we do is we start with the generic survey, and that is, how comfortable are you with AI? Are you using it personally? Are you using it professionally? How are you using it? What tasks do you keep repeating over and over and over again? What would you like AI to take off of your plate? And then, we do some knowledge questions. we make sure that, we fine tune that survey to each and every organization. And then we do the training. And the training is based on where your people are, right? If they're all early adopters and they're all, into AI and they've used everything and they know how to make images and they know how to get rid of hallucinations and reduce mistakes, then you start at a very different place, right? With many governments, I start with basic building blocks of prompting. What is a good prompt? How do you make it accurate? How do you make it cite sources right in your voice and with your branding, etc.? But then once that basic training's over, we do another survey to see how comfortable they are now and to see what they've learned and to see where they're still weak. And we actually create a pretty good, it's not a test, but it's a survey, about what their capabilities are now. And we try to keep most of those same questions throughout the whole process. But at some point, of course, people have to break away. So now we're going to be talking to the communication group. And so we're going to then develop a workflow just for them. And, as far as the tools and all that, that's really up to what they're allowed to use, what their governance says, what the cost is, and very separate from what you're talking about here, which is why this is so fascinating for me. But so then we start doing separate workflows, and what we also do is after we teach you those workflows, and you have to practice, you have to start using them, then we really are able to see how much time it took you before you started this workflow, and now 2 months later that you're using it, how much time you've saved. And if you think it's better, if you think it's accurate, we try to track mistakes and errors. So we put a whole process in place for that, which I think is really critical, because otherwise you are just sort of shooting from the hip, trying random things, not knowing what works. You want to build one central repository, one single source of truth is what it's called, where you want to put in all your high-level prompts and workflows so that everybody goes there to use it. And then you really want to make sure that you try to stop the personal usage altogether, again, with policies and consequences and things like that. Is that helpful?
I found that really helpful. Thank you. And I also saw that Georg and Nera were talking in the chat, so maybe we want to do a quick voiceover over that.
Yeah, great. I mean, it's a great question. And to be honest, I'm not aware of too many examples from municipalities really sort of like applying very micro level implementations of AI. So it's definitely something that we'd be interested in if others have experiences. What we do see is that first, it could definitely help create sort of like more specific kind of like insights. It's often being done sort of like at the very basic like chat bot level, and chatbots can be, in the most case, rather cumbersome to actually get through them. So chatbots aren't quite effective, but there are examples where sort of like micro implementations kind of like are successful, but at the same time they run with risk as well, because then the implementations, the LMMs, lack a little bit of the contextualization, particularly in languages. So there's a good example from a kind of like a health service in Peru, where the kind of like the Spanish language support worked well, but then the indigenous translation or language support did not provide the correct responses, and started to hallucinate quite dramatically. So I think these are exactly the kinds of questions that we need to investigate further as we have more examples of LMMs and AI tools being implemented. And I'm quite curious about that as well. So I'll definitely look more into some of our partners to see if there's some specifics that I can gather.
Yeah. I think we just had a closeout slide, I think, right, as our last one. So where we'll put it up while we keep talking, so you can see our how you can find us. We definitely feel free to reach out to us at any point. We would love to hear from you, and if you want some help or so, don't be shy about reaching out to us. highlighting something, Richard, I think that is a great idea, like nutrition labels for AI. So I don't know if anyone has seen anything like that, or can feel free, please, to unmute and share.
The only problem with that is it is changing by the day, sometimes by the hour, the capability. So 6 months ago, I would not have recommended Claude so heavily to my clients as I do today because of what is possible today with Claude and co-work and dispatch, et cetera, et cetera. So it changes so fast. I just think that'd be difficult to do and keep it up to date. So it's almost like a day by day thing. I don't, does somebody else have a different opinion on that?
Okay, Kat, you want to talk about the standard? Oh,
Sure. Oh, yeah. There are two relevant things. One is if you're not already aware that GovAI leads an effort called fact sheets, there's a ready at hand template you can use to require certain kinds of disclosures from vendors, and that should be able to assist you in comparisons between different systems. DTPR is a really exciting public facing resource. So let's say you already have a system up and out. How does the public understand what that system does and doesn't do to allay certain concerns they might have? DTPR is a really exciting visual effort to make that communication more accessible to residents. And I'll just bop to you, Albert.
Yeah, I thank you, Meg. I was gonna bring up the fact sheet as well, and let me see if I can get the link to that and just drop it in the chat. I also want to highlight, absolutely, I see the numbers on these things, like the performance levels on these tools, change pretty frequently. What I Over the last 3 years, what I have not seen change that frequently is the metrics that we use to evaluate those tools. And so what I mean by that is it's not like every day the world is changing. It's just the numbers underneath how we're evaluating, or the numbers that we're seeing on the tools are changing. It's kind of like the stock market. Like every day we still trade on the New York Stock Exchange. That's not changing. It's just the number that the stock is at. Yeah, the score changes, scorecard stays the same. Thank you, Meg.
I love that. Great. And then, Georg, do you want to talk a little bit about the myths? Actually, our AI guide has a myth busting section of like what some common myths are and what's true or not true about them, or otherwise we are some time and I see some people are dropping off. You can definitely check them out in the guide as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the myths that I just highlight is that if you think technology and procurement, it automatically includes AI. And I think there's still a lot of space for non-AI technology procurement. Obviously we need better systems that, provide caseworkers with their services, etc. And the myth is that now you have to include AI, and I don't think that is necessarily the case. There's a lot of case to be made for not including AI just yet, I think. So that's one. And the other one that I wanted to highlight is sort of like that myth is, you bring in AI and it will change everything. And I think one of the big problems is that there is so much existing technology infrastructure that if AI is not interoperable, open, it will fail, as will any other technology procurement. Like you can't come in with this idea, we just plug it on top of our existing systems. They have to speak to each other. So as much as like an AI solution needs to speak with, as much as you and your procurement teams have to speak to each other, and the ISO solution has to speak to each other as well, like to the different teams and resources, etc. And I think that is where we see a lot of the problems in the implementation and why implementation is still so slow. So I'd say, AI is definitely not the solution that comes in and solves everything, which we probably figured out already. But I think it's just so important to make sure that there's so much infrastructure that already exists, and it sort of like has to link in as well. So those would be two kind of like myths in a way that I just kind of like bring up for closing. I don't know. Do you have one of your favorite ones?
No, those are two. I think, or sometimes I think governments also feel I actually don't have much choice or much control,
Yes.
right? And I think I hope this presentation showed you that between, all the way from better planning to what Meg highlighted, evaluations, or you're saying, using enterprise licenses as a foundation, but not the destination. There is choice, right? And you can choose and build your tech, like we said in the beginning, that aligns more with your purpose and what you're trying to do versus necessarily feeling you're being forced into a tech relationship that you might not want to have. Okay, I see we have time for one more question. Lan, please.
Yes, I just remembered when you said a human-centered approach. I love that. And in reality, also some local leaders are thinking that along with AI adoption, they care about the uniquely human functions that we don't want to be overtaken by AI. And so there is some effort to look from that lens. So I just wanted to bring that up for your awareness, and maybe you may be able to include that as an example of the human-centered approach.
And I think you highlight something really important, right? In a moment where sort of like there's really a trust in government, because we feel so far away from governments through technology in many ways, that one-on-one human contact and enabling that, technology just being like an enabler for that, I think is something to keep in mind as we sort of like think about AI and procurement and sort of like where we think about like how public benefit and government delivers for people and communities.
Wonderful. What nice closing words. I think we have to end here with 3 minutes to go and these nice inspirations. So thank you again so much for having us. Jarasa, thank you for sharing more. We are definitely big on human-centered. So I love that we are ending the conversation with that. Meg, anything?
I just wanted to say, please join me in thanking Katrin and Georg. This was definitely a highlight in terms of a presentation, and there were a lot of messages I got from people sad to miss it, so they'll be tuning in for the recording. Thanks again for joining us, both of you.
What a nice day for us as well. Is it Wednesday today? To spend our Wednesday afternoon. So thank you for the midweek lift up, and we see you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for being here today. It was a great presentation.
Take care.
Mhm.